Wernher von Braun is a name known around the world. The man who built the Saturn V, the rocket that carried humans to the moon, is celebrated as a hero of the space age. But von Braun did not work alone. Behind him stood a team of engineers, each as skilled as he was. One of them was more important than most. He was the man who actually managed the production of the VR-2 rocket. He was the man who later became the project director for the Saturn V. His name was Arthur Rudolph. And unlike von Braun, he did not die a celebrated American hero. He died in Germany, stripped of his US citizenship, a man without a country. Arthur Louis Hugo Rudolph was born in 1906 in Stepfershausen, a small town in the German Empire. His father was a farmer. His mother died when he was young. The family had little money. But young Arthur was fascinated by machines. He studied at a technical school and found work in a factory. By the late 1920s, he had discovered a new passion, rocketry. Germany at the time was home to a small but enthusiastic community of rocket amateurs. Rudolph joined the Verein für Raumschifffahrt, the same rocket club that von Braun had joined. He was not a university graduate like von Braun. He was a practical engineer. He knew how to build things. In 1931, 2 years before Adolf Hitler came to power, Arthur Rudolph joined the Nazi Party. He did not join because he was forced. He joined because he believed in the party's vision. An early US Army intelligence report would later describe him with stark words: 100% Nazi, dangerous type, security threat. This was not an exaggeration. Rudolph was an early and enthusiastic supporter of the regime. Rudolph's technical skill was undeniable. By the late 1930s, he was working at the Piemont Army Research Center alongside von Braun. While von Braun was the visionary, the public face of the rocket program, Rudolph was the production man. He understood manufacturing, assembly lines, and quality control. When the V-2 rocket moved from prototype to mass production, Rudolph was placed in charge of the production line. His job was to ensure that hundreds of V-2 rockets could be built quickly and reliably. The V-2 was a complex machine. It had thousands of parts. Each had to fit perfectly. Any defect could cause the rocket to explode on launch, or worse, to fail in flight and crash unpredictably. Rudolph's background in factory management made him the ideal person for this role. He was not designing engines or guidance systems. He was making sure that the engines and guidance systems could be built by ordinary workers. This sounds like a purely technical job. But in Nazi Germany, the ordinary workers were not ordinary at all. Arthur Rudolph was not a monster who personally beat prisoners. He was not a doctor who performed experiments. He was an engineer. He was a manager. He looked at production charts, not at the faces of the people building the rockets. This is what made him dangerous. He was not a sadist. He was a man who cared more about the machine than about the hands that built it. And that, in the end, was his crime. The boy from Stepfershausen had built a career on rockets. But the foundation of that career was built on the suffering of thousands. In 1943, the war was turning against Germany. The British Royal Air Force had bombed Piemont. The surface factory was no longer safe. Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, made a decision. V-2 production would move underground. A network of tunnels near Nordhausen, in central Germany, would become the new factory. The place was called Mittelwerk. It was dark, cold, and damp. The workers were not German citizens. They were prisoners from concentration camps. Arthur Rudolph was sent to Mittelwerk to manage production. He was 37 years old. This is where his story turns dark. The Mittelwerk tunnels were originally built for fuel storage. 2 main tunnels ran parallel, each about a mile long. Cross tunnels connected them. The total underground area was enormous, more than 600,000 square feet. The conditions were brutal. There was no natural light. The air was thick with dust, fumes, and the smell of unwashed bodies. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer. There were no safety measures. Accidents were common. A falling rocket component could kill a worker instantly. The SS guards were violent. Beatings were routine. Executions by hanging occurred in the tunnels themselves. The prisoners came from Mittelbau-Dora, a concentration camp built specifically to supply labor for Mittelwerk. They were political prisoners, Soviet POWs, Jews, Roma, and other enemies of the Nazi regime. Many were skilled workers, electricians, mechanics, welders. The SS selected them for their technical abilities. But even the skilled workers starved. The daily food ration was bread, watery soup, and sometimes a small piece of sausage. This was not enough for men doing heavy physical labor. Prisoners collapsed at their workstations. Those who could not continue were sent back to the camp. Many never returned to the factory. Arthur Rudolph's job was to manage the V2 assembly line. He reported directly to Albin Sawatsky, the technical director of Mittelwerk. Rudolph's responsibilities included production scheduling, quality control, and workforce management. The workforce was prisoners. Rudolph had the authority to request more prisoners from the camp. He had the authority to reject prisoners who were too weak to work. He knew that rejected prisoners would likely be killed. He knew that the prisoners who remained were starving, sick, and exhausted. He did not change his production targets. Historians have documented Rudolph's role in detail. He was present at Mittelwerk frequently. He inspected the assembly lines. He discussed production problems with SS officers. He wrote memos about improving efficiency. One memo, dated September 13, 1943, discusses a production delay. Rudolph blames insufficient labor and requests additional prisoners. The memo does not mention the condition of the workers. It does not ask for better food or medical care. The workers are treated as machines. Broken machines are replaced. The production line continues. Rudolph was good at his job. Under his management, Mittelwerk produced more than 6,000 V2 rockets. At the peak of production, the factory built 35 rockets per day. This was an extraordinary achievement for wartime manufacturing. But the achievement came at a staggering cost. Historians estimate that about 20,000 prisoners died at Mittelbau-Dora and its subcamps. More people died building the V2 than were killed by the V2 in combat. Rudolph's efficiency had a body count. After the war, Arthur Rudolph would claim that he had no choice. He would say that refusing to work would have meant his own death. He would say that he did not know the full extent of the atrocities. But the documents tell a different story. Rudolph was not a prisoner. He was a manager. He had authority. He had knowledge. He had options. He chose to continue. The rocket factory was his creation. And the blood on the factory floor was on his hands. By April 1945, the Mittelwerk factory was surrounded. American tanks were approaching from the west. The Soviet army was advancing from the east. The Third Reich was in its final death throes. Arthur Rudolph watched the collapse from inside the tunnels. He knew that the war was lost. He also knew that his position as a Nazi Party member and a senior manager at a slave labor factory made him a target. He had to escape. He had to hide his past. And he had to find a way to the Americans, not the Soviets. The Soviets would hang him. The Americans might use him. On April 11, 1945, American troops entered the Mittelwerk tunnels. What they found shocked them. Thousands of completed V2 rockets stood on assembly lines. Technical documents covered every surface. But the soldiers also found something else. They found the prisoners. Hundreds of emaciated, dying men were still in the tunnels. Many were too weak to stand. Some had died where they lay. The Americans photographed everything. The images of Mittelbau-Dora were published in newspapers across the United States. The world saw for the first time what the V2 program had cost in human lives. Arthur Rudolph was not there when the Americans arrived. He had fled weeks earlier. He traveled south, away from the advancing Soviet army, toward the Bavarian Alps. He hoped to blend in with millions of other German refugees. He carried no documents identifying him as a Nazi Party member. He carried no papers linking him to Mittelwerk. He was just another German engineer looking for work. Or so he hoped. The Americans, however, had a list. They knew the names of every key VO2 engineer. Rudolph's name was on that list. The American intelligence operation that targeted German scientists was called Operation Overcast. It was later renamed Operation Paperclip. The goal was to bring as many German technical experts to the United States as possible before the Soviets captured them. Von Braun was the prize. But von Braun's team included hundreds of engineers. Arthur Rudolph was one of the most valuable. He knew how to mass-produce rockets. He understood assembly lines, quality control, and supply chains. These were skills that American industry needed. The fact that Rudolph had managed a factory staffed by slave laborers was not considered disqualifying. The Paperclip program had rules. Nazi party members were not supposed to be admitted. War criminals were not supposed to be admitted. But the rules were flexible. Background checks were superficial. Investigators often accepted the scientists' own statements without verification. Documents were sanitized. Incriminating evidence was removed from files. The need for rocket expertise outweighed the need for justice. Rudolph was interviewed by American intelligence officers. He told them what they wanted to hear. He said he had been a reluctant Nazi. He said he had not known about the atrocities at Mittelwerk. He said he was just an engineer doing his job. The Americans believed him. Or they chose to believe him. In November 1945, Arthur Rudolph arrived in the United States. He was assigned to Fort Bliss, Texas, alongside von Braun and the other Paperclip scientists. He was given a salary, a house, and a new identity. His Nazi past was buried in classified files. The man who had managed the slave labor factory that produced 6,000 V-2 rockets was now an American government employee. The collapse of Germany had given him a second chance. He would use that chance to build something new. But the past was not dead. It was only sleeping. Arthur Rudolph arrived in the United States with nothing. No money. No family. No friends. He spoke little English. He was a former Nazi party member who had managed a slave labor factory. By every measure, he should have faded into obscurity. But he had one thing that America wanted: knowledge. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Cold War was heating up. The Soviet Union was winning the space race. America needed rockets. And Rudolph knew how to build them. He climbed from a junior engineer at Fort Bliss to the project director of the most powerful rocket ever built. This was the American dream. But it was built on a foundation of lies. Rudolph's first years in America were quiet. He worked at Fort Bliss, Texas, then at the Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. He was part of von Braun's team. His job was to help adapt the VO2 for American purposes. The rockets were launched from White Sands, New Mexico. They carried scientific instruments. They tested new guidance systems. Rudolph was good at his job. He was organized, disciplined, and technically brilliant. Von Braun trusted him. By the late 1950s, Rudolph had been promoted. He was now managing entire missile programs. The Redstone missile. The Jupiter missile. Both were direct descendants of the VR-2. Both became the backbone of America's early ballistic missile arsenal. In 1960, NASA was created. Von Braun's team was transferred from the Army to the new civilian space agency. Rudolph went with them. He became the deputy project manager for the Saturn V rocket. This was the highest position ever held by a Paperclip scientist. He was responsible for the engineering, manufacturing, and testing of the first stage, the most powerful part of the rocket. If the first stage failed, the mission failed. There was no backup. Rudolph carried that weight. The Saturn V first stage, called the SIC, was enormous. It stood 42 meters tall. It contained 5 F-1 engines. Each engine produced 1.5 million pounds of thrust. The 5 engines together generated 7.5 million pounds of thrust, enough to lift 2.8 million kilograms off the ground. The The fuel tanks held 770,000 liters of kerosene and 1.2 million liters of liquid oxygen. The engines burned for just 2 minutes and 42 seconds. In that time, they consumed the entire propellant load. The rocket accelerated from 0 to 6,000 miles per hour. Rudolph's job was to make sure the first stage worked. He oversaw the assembly of each SIC stage at the Michoud assembly facility in New Orleans. He traveled to the Kennedy Space Center for every launch. He watched from the control room as the F-01 engines ignited. He later said that the moment of liftoff was the greatest feeling of his life. He had come from the Mittelwerk tunnels to the launch pad of Apollo. The same man who had managed slave labor was now sending astronauts to the moon. He did not see the contradiction. Or he chose not to see it. The Saturn V never failed. 13 launches. 13 successes. No other rocket in history has matched this record. Rudolph's technical skill was a key reason. He demanded perfection from his team. He inspected every component. He refused to cut corners. The prisoners at Mittelwerk had built rockets that sometimes failed. The workers at Michoud built rockets that never failed. The difference was not just technology. It was the conditions. Free workers do better work than slaves. Rudolph knew this. He had always known this. But at Mittelwerk, he had not cared. On July 16, 1969, Arthur Rudolph watched the Saturn V lift off with Apollo 11. For days later, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Rudolph had achieved everything he could have dreamed. The boy from Stepfershausen, the Nazi engineer, the slave labor manager, he was now a hero of the space age. He received awards. He was celebrated. He was promoted. The American dream had come true. But dreams cannot hide the truth forever. And the truth was about to catch up with him. Arthur Rudolph retired from NASA in 1969. He was 63 years old. He moved to San Jose, California, to live quietly with his wife. He had worked for the United States government for 24 years. He had helped win the Cold War. He had helped put humans on the moon. He expected to live out his days as a respected engineer. But history does not forget. And in the 1980s, a new generation of investigators began asking questions that should have been asked 40 years earlier. They wanted to know what Arthur Rudolph had done at Mittelwerk. They wanted to know who had let him into America. And they wanted justice. In 1979, the United States Department of Justice created a new office, the Office of Special Investigations, or OSI. Its mission was to identify and deport Nazi war criminals who had entered the United States illegally after World War II. For decades, America had been a safe haven for former Nazis. The OSI was created to change that. The investigators were young, determined, and relentless. They combed through archives in Germany, Poland, Israel, and the United States. They interviewed survivors. They translated documents. And they found names. One of the names they found was Arthur Rudolph. The OSI investigators gathered evidence. They found Rudolph's Nazi Party membership file. He had joined in 1931, 2 years before Hitler came to power. He was not a reluctant Nazi. He was an early supporter. They found documents showing that Rudolph had managed the Mittelwerk factory. They found his memos requesting more prisoners. They found testimony from survivors who remembered him inspecting the assembly lines. The evidence was overwhelming. Rudolph had been a key figure in the VA2 slave labor program. And he had lied about it to American immigration officials. The OSI built a legal case against Rudolph. The case was not about war crimes in the strict sense. Rudolph had not personally beaten or killed anyone. The case was about immigration fraud. When Rudolph applied to enter the United States in 1945, he had signed a statement saying that he had never been a member of the Nazi Party. This was false. He had signed a statement saying that he had never supported the Nazi regime. This was also false. The OSI argued that Rudolph had entered the country illegally because his application contained lies. Therefore, his citizenship, granted in 1954, was invalid. Rudolf hired lawyers. He fought back. He argued that he had only joined the Nazi Party because it was necessary for his career. He argued that he had not known about the atrocities at Mittelwerk. He argued that he had been forced to work there. The OSI presented counter-evidence. They showed that Rudolf had joined the party in 1931, long before it was necessary for career advancement. They showed that he had visited Mittelwerk frequently and had written memos about production. They showed that he had never been forced to work there, he had volunteered. In 1983, the OSI presented its findings to Rudolf. They gave him a choice. He could contest the case in court. A trial would be public. Survivors would testify. Documents would be shown to the world. Or he could sign an agreement. He would voluntarily give up his American citizenship. He would leave the United States permanently. In exchange, the government would not prosecute him for war crimes. Rudolf chose the agreement. On March 14, 1984, Arthur Rudolf signed the agreement. He renounced his American citizenship. He packed his belongings. He and his wife left San Jose and flew to Germany. He settled in Hamburg, the city where he had once worked as a young engineer. He died there on January 1, 1996, at the age of 89. He never returned to the United States. He was the only paperclip scientist to lose his American citizenship. Von Braun had died a hero. Rudolf died in exile. The reckoning had come at last. Wernher von Braun died a hero. He is buried in Alexandria, Virginia, with a tombstone quoting the Bible. Museums celebrate him. Schools are named after him. Documentaries portray him as the visionary who took humanity to the moon. Arthur Rudolf died in obscurity. He is buried in Hamburg, Germany, far from the country where he did his greatest work. His name appears in history books only as a footnote. Two men. Two similar pasts. Two very different fates. Why? The answer is not simple. But it reveals something important about how history judges the people who build the machines of war and exploration. The difference between von Braun and Rudolf is not about their actions. Both men were Nazi Party members. Both men worked at Mittelwerk. Both men knew that prisoners were building their rockets. Both men did nothing to stop it. The difference is about their public image. Von Braun understood public relations. He cultivated journalists. He appeared on television. He wrote articles for popular magazines. He told the story of a man who dreamed of space and was forced to work for the Nazis. He never fully told the truth, but he told a story that Americans wanted to hear. Rudolf did none of this. He was an engineer, not a showman. He stayed in the background. He let von Braun be the face of the rocket program. When journalists asked questions, Rudolf deferred to von Braun. He did not build relationships with the press. He did not shape his own narrative. When the OSI came for him, he had no defenders. There were no journalists writing articles about his contributions. No politician speaking in his defense. He was alone. And he was expendable. The OSI case against Rudolf was legally sound. He had lied on his immigration forms. His citizenship was therefore invalid. But the same could be said for many paperclip scientists. Von Braun had also lied. His Nazi Party membership was also hidden. His role at Mittelwerk was also downplayed. But von Braun was never investigated. Why? Because von Braun was too important. By the 1980s, von Braun was dead. But his legacy was alive. NASA depended on the story of Apollo. The Saturn V was a symbol of American greatness. Exposing von Braun would mean exposing the entire paperclip program. It would mean admitting that America had knowingly welcomed Nazi war criminals. The government was not willing to do that. Rudolf was a safer target. He was less famous. He was still alive. His deportation would not threaten the mythology of the space program. The OSI pursued him aggressively because they could. They left von Braun alone because they could not. This is not justice. It is politics. Rudolph was punished not because he was more guilty than von Braun, but because he was less useful to the story America wanted to tell about itself. Arthur Rudolph was not a good man. He managed a factory where thousands of slaves died. He never apologized. He never showed remorse. But he was also not uniquely evil. He was one of many engineers who chose rockets over humanity. The difference between him and von Braun is not morality. It is fame. Von Braun died a hero because America needed a hero. Rudolph died in exile because no one needed him anymore. The rockets worked. The Cold War ended. The moon landings became history. And the men who built the machines were judged not by what they did, but by how useful their stories were. That is the darkest legacy of the space age. Not the rockets. Not the war crimes. The forgetting.
Write your questions in the comments. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for upcoming episodes of the documentary series. New documentaries are released every Wednesday and Friday on this channel.